hopefully we are recording. This is like the 5th attempt, and hopefully we won't be bombarded by a certain cat. So today is the final part of this series on relevant observances. So today's presentation is the third and final part in this series on dates of occurrence. I recommend watching part 1 and part 2 in their sequential order to better understand the whole picture of the argument being presented. It may help to watch them at 1.25 or 1.5 playback speed. So for a quick summary, part 1 includes some information on the case, a few relevant definitions of terminology, a quick overview of Carroll County history, stats, and demographics, and some descriptions of concurrent Christian observances with the dates of the murders. Part 2 covers pre-Christian European, primarily ancient Roman pagan observances coinciding with those dates. It briefly describes some common aspects of general pagan belief and practice in comparison to Christianity. It also attempts to explain the pagan-Christian overlap unique to Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire and during the rise of the Catholic Church. So this third and final presentation will be addressing Norse Germanic pagan belief and practice, especially focusing on rituals dedicated to specific spirits during certain parts of the year. It is these rituals that we'll be looking at closely to find connections between those pagan observances and the dates of occurrence when Abby Williams and Libby German were killed. I will reiterate, it is my belief, based on the information researched and collected in this series, that the dates when these crimes were committed are very likely connected to a non-secular pagan observance with historical ties to human sacrifice. Disclaimer: these theories presented in this video are by no means set in stone. They cannot be definitively proven without apprehending and then extracting information from the perpetrator or perpetrators of this crime. The point is to show that the connection exists between the dates of the murders and historically documented pagan ritual and sacrifice. This presentation is not meant to be exciting. It's not meant to entertain. It's meant to inform people following this case that there is a very strong argument to be made that the murders were meticulously planned to overtly include historical pagan symbols and acts. Regardless of accuracy applied by the perpetrator or perpetrators, the symbols exist. They are there. It's up to the viewer or listener to develop their own opinions and thoughts on whether or not they find this information compelling and or relevant to the murders of Abby and Libby. So, having covered ancient Rome, we will now travel north into Northern Europe and Scandinavia to look at some of the pagan practices observed around mid-February. Firstly, it might be helpful to understand that after the fall of Rome, regions that had benefited from some of the civilizing aspects of the empire were quickly thrown into disarray. Places that had kept out Roman occupation probably still experienced some disruption or even caused it. But overall, the chaos was not as intense as elsewhere. Therefore, life continued much like it had, or possibly even progressed through trade and organizing forces like kingship and kingdoms. Overall, the Germanic peoples of what is modern-day Germany, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway remained relatively unaffected, allowing their beliefs and practices to remain intact, especially concerning the veneration of their gods and ancestors. So ancestry held great significance for ancient Norse pagans, which was deeply embedded in their worldview and cultural practices. Adherence to ancestor worship created and maintained a mutual relationship through the living and the spirits of those who once lived. Honoring these spirits through rituals and offerings established a positive connection to seek their continued benevolence, guidance, or protection. The ancestors were believed to be the spirits or the souls of deceased family members who continued to retain a connection to the living world. Families would often maintain altars or sacred spaces dedicated to them, where they would offer food, drink, and other gifts. Some rituals involved communal gatherings, storytelling, and the recitation of genealogies to honor and remember the deeds of the previous generations. Certain festivals and holidays were dedicated to honoring them. Particular funerary practices also played a significant role in maintaining proper ancestral connections so that their spirits would watch over their living descendants, provide advice, and intervene in times of need. So, there's a lot of ancestral importance in Norse Germanic pagan culture. So, ancestry provided a direct link to the past, connecting individuals with their predecessors and their deeds, which further anchored individuals within a lineage that then extended back through time. Ancestry helped define individual and collective identities within Norse Germanic society. Knowing one's lineage established a sense of belonging and membership within specific kinship groups, which were central to social organization. Further, many Norse myths and legends revolved around the exploits of legendary ancestors and heroes, which ancient pagans sought to emulate their heroic virtues and draw strength from their legendary examples. More practically, the inheritance of property, status, and even certain rights were often tied to one's ancestry. Knowing and honoring one's ancestors reinforced social hierarchies and familial obligations within local communities. Ancestry emphasized the continuity of life and the passing down of traditions, values, and knowledge from one generation to the next. And this sense of continuity reinforced cultural cohesion and the preservation of Norse customs and beliefs. So some ancestral concepts that we'll be considering, at least in this slide, is the hamingja, and the fylgja. So the hamingja is akin to a person's personal fortune, luck, or guardian spirit. It's often associated with personal inheritance or accumulated luck or fortune throughout life. It can be inherited from one's ancestors and is closely tied to family lineage. Collectively, it represents the luck and fortune of a family or clan passed down through generations. Individually, it can be the personal luck or fate of an individual shaped by their actions and the actions of their ancestors. It was believed that one's actions could either enhance or diminish the hamingja of their descendants. So, in comparison, the fylgja refers specifically to a form of guardian spirit or animal familiar associated with an individual. It's often depicted as an animal that follows a person throughout life, representing their fate or destiny. The fylgja can be seen as an extension of the person's soul or spirit, and it was believed to foretell or influence the course of events in a person's life. Seeing or encountering one's fylgja could be an omen of significant events to come. The fylgja is considered a protective entity capable of guiding and warning its associated individual. It can appear in dreams or visions and is believed to have a mystical connection to the person it accompanies. And based on some of those sources, as I recall, if one were to see one's fylgja in real life, like not in a dream setting and not as like a figment of one's imagination. But if one were to see it in real life, it usually portended something akin to misfortune, or it was bad luck. So both Haminya and Firya involve the idea of spiritual guardianship. Haminya is a broader concept encompassing both familial and personal fortune, while the Firya is a specific type of guardian spirit, often manifested as an animal. But the Firya can also be portrayed as a human person too. Both Haminya and Firya are believed to influence an individual's fate and destiny, and both concepts are linked to ancestry. Haminya more directly and Firya less so, but they're both still linked. So there do exist many other types of ancestral spirits, and one in particular, which will be relevant to this presentation, is the Disir. So now to go over the Disir, while much information remains unknown and varies regionally, the Dis, singular, or the Disir, plural, are powerful female spirits or beings who took a keen interest in families, ancestral lineages, land, and estates, and the deeds or fate of specific individuals. So they already sound very familiar to like the Haminya or Firya. Sometimes regarded as protective spirits of families or clans, the Disir could follow family members and sometimes whole villages to provide protection against evil magics. Their strength and influence could vary greatly, sometimes described as ancestral guardian spirits, sometimes portrayed as lesser local deities. And their veneration may also derive from the worship of the spirits of the dead. So the Disir are considered to be mostly benevolent, helpful, or protective. They usually use their power for good, acting as guardians to households or homesteads, and sometimes even lending their protection to individual people. However, they could be antagonistic and even formidable forces when angered. They did not necessarily love unconditionally or serve altruistically. The Disir were known to take revenge against families or people who had not given proper sacrifice or had otherwise disrespected or disrupted the delicate balance necessary for their blessings. Surviving Norse texts describe the Disir as resembling other female spirits, some scholars even suggesting them to be a variety of other female entities or beings, such as the Vatir, the Firgir, the Valkyries, and Norns. Like the Valkyries, Norns, and Vatir, the Disir are usually referred collectively in surviving references. And despite overlapping qualities with other mythological spirits and various attributions, the Disir featured some standard traits. They are always portrayed as female entities, and they all required worthy honorary sacrifices and feasts, especially during winter nights in Iceland and Norway, or the Disablot, and in Sweden, the Disting. So scholars have found similarities between the Disir and other forms of matron worship throughout Scandinavia, Germany, and Britain. In Norse mythological texts, the Disir seem most closely tied in purpose to the Valkyries and the Firgir. And Firgir is just the plural form of Firgir. Ultimately, the Disir remain a mysterious group of beings who, although they did not have a clear position in the hierarchy of the Norse gods, were seen as powerful spirits that deserved respect. So now, to go over some of these festivals that honor them, we'll first cover the Disting, and it, when broken down, is Disathing, and a thing is an assembly, So the Disting or Disathing is an assembly for the Disir. So Disting was an ancient Norse pagan celebration primarily observed in Uppsala, Sweden. It was held around early to mid-February, coinciding with the midpoint between the winter solstice and spring equinox. The gathering, which lasted for about a week, honored the female spirits known as the Disir, who were, of course, the ancestral spirits or guardian spirits of the land or familial groups. They were also associated with fertility, hence the early spring timing, protection, and fate. So the Disathing or Dising was known for its marketplace where people gathered to buy, sell, and trade goods. The market may have originated as a way to facilitate economic exchange and social interaction among communities. So the Dising involved communal feasting, where people gathered to share food and drink. Feasting served to honor the spirits and foster community bonds. And there were usually various rituals and ceremonies that were performed during the Disling to invoke blessings for fertility, protection, and prosperity. And these rituals could involve chanting, dancing, and sacrifices, which we will get to later. It also could involve forms of fortune-telling and divination, such as casting lots, interpreting omens, or using special tools or objects like mirrors or wells to divine one's future mate, or if the crops will do well. So these are also practiced to seek guidance for the upcoming year. So now we'll kind of look at some of the historical sources that do reference Disling. So in the Heimskringla, which is a collection of 16 sagas about the Swedish and Norwegian kings, it begins with the mythological prehistory of legendary Swedish and Norwegian, the Norwegian royal dynasty of the Ynglings, and the Ynglings trace their lineage back to the Vanir god Freyr of the Vanaland people, who arrived in Scandinavia with Odin from the legendary Asgard. The subsequent sagas are, with few exceptions, devoted to individual historical Norwegian rulers. So the Heimskringla collection was written by the Icelandic historian and poet Snorri Sturluson, circa 1230 CE. And one of the sagas included in the Heimskringla was the Olaf Saga Helga, or the Saga of Saint Olaf, and it includes a description of the Disting celebration. So, quote, "In Sweden, it was the old custom, while heathenry was there, that the most important sacrifice had to be held at Uppsala in the month of Goi, or Goi? I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Sacrifices had to be offered for Frith and for the victory of their king, and people had to come there from the entire Swedish realm. There also had to be an assembly of all Swedes, and there was also a market and fair there, and it lasted a week. When Christianity was in Sweden, the legal assembly and market were still held. Now, ever since Christianity became the custom in Sweden, and the kings refused to stay at Uppsala, the market was moved and held at Candlemas. And it has been ever since then. And now it lasts no more than 3 days. The assembly of the Swedes is there, and they come there from all over the country." So after Christianization, the Disling, was moved from its lunar-dependent date to the 2nd of February, which we've gone over in the previous presentation, but the 2nd of February usually was called Candlemas, or formerly referred to as the Roman Catholic Feast of the Purification of the Virgin. So according to the Uppsland Log, a medieval Swedish record, the Disling was a legal assembly and market. During the assembly, it was mandatory to keep the peace of disting. So when Sturluson is referencing sacrifices that had to be offered for Frith, Frith was kind of like a more complicated peace. It was, everybody working together to ensure the well-being of the kingdom. So the Frith, or the peace of disting, and disting usually took place at a flat-topped mound at Gamla Uppsala. So I got a lot of this information from the troth.org, and they went into even more detail. It was very fascinating, and I recommend anybody interested go and check it out. So, when is disting? By our modern calendar, disting could fall between the 20th of January and the 19th of February. According to the German diplomat Erik Lasota of Striblau, living in Sweden circa 1590 CE, disting was a yearly fair or market. He attested to the celebration falling on the full moon, after the first new moon, after the day of the Holy Three Kings, or the Epiphany, which was January 6th. So, Swedish scholar Olof Rudbeck learned from rural locals that the full moon shining on Epiphany is the Yule moon, and the following moon in February is the disting moon. And other 17th century writers on Swedish customs confirm this date, including Johannes Boreas, Olaus Ormius, Johannes Schaferus, and Magnus Celsius. In pre-Christian times, disting was likely determined by some other fixed date. The disting holiday was held under the full moon, about 14 days after the start of the disting, or February month, and it's also referred to as the GOI month, and I'm not sure how to pronounce that, so I saw that a lot too. Then the winter solstice and other critical days determined by solar or astral observances for regulating the lunar months might have been determined by the rising and setting of the sun and moon aligned with the burial mounds at Uppsala. So many of these dates could have also been determined by how the shadows were cast based on these three mounds. They're called the royal mounds, and they're in the city of Uppsala and Gamla specifically. So I just want to reiterate that according to this Erik Lasota of Striblau, disting fell on the first full moon after the first new moon after the 6th of January, or the Christian feast of the Epiphany. So if we're to think about it, if the first new moon after the 6th of January in 2017 falls on the 28th of January, then the first new moon, or first full moon after the first new moon of the 28th of January after the Epiphany was the 11th of February 2017, which would have been a Saturday. And I got these records from the lunaf.com/lunar calendar. So again, here's Epiphany. It's the 6th, okay? And then that's a full moon in January. The new moon in January is the 28th, which is a Saturday, okay? So the full moon, the first full moon after the first new moon after the 6th of January, or Epiphany, is when, on or about when, disting would take place. So I also looked up some of the records for that day, for both the 13th and the 14th and they were different. It recorded different day lengths, the highs and lows for the day, dew point, max wind speed, and visibility. But then it also gave me the times of the rising and setting of the moon. So the moon would have risen at 9:22 on that day, on the 13th, and it would have set at 9:14. So assuming if it was cloudy or not, the moon in its waning gibbous still is giving off quite a bit of light. And if somebody knew that terrain well, the path or the area would have been well enough lit that they could have made their way down to where ultimately they left the girls out in the open, because there would have been enough light. So another observance that I thought we should consider, it is very similar to this thing, and it's often used interchangeably, but it might be incorrect to do that, is this thing called dieselblot. So the dieselblot is a blot or a sacrifice for the disir. And there are several sagas, the Hervarar, the Vigagrums, the Eagles, and the Heimskringla, that mention the observance of dieselblot, which was celebrated either in autumn or leading into spring. So there are more sources that testify to the dieselblot being observed during the pre-Christian Scandinavian winter nights, which would fall about 28 days after the autumn equinox. And the first 3 days of the winter nights signified the transition from autumn to the winter season. And it was typical on that first day of the winter nights to closely monitor the weather to determine a general forecast for the coming winter. So if snow fell on the first day, then it would be a snowy winter, or like a fully defoliated or leafless tree may mean an early onset of harsh wintry conditions. And this of course is very similar in practice to the divining of the arrival of spring. In the US it's Groundhog's Day. So it's based on a long-held observance by the Pennsylvania Dutch, who are German. They're not Dutch, but they're German. So if on the 2nd of February a groundhog emerges from their burrow and sees its shadow or sunny weather, winter will continue for another 6 weeks. If it doesn't see its shadow, so it's cloudy weather, spring will arrive early. But I found it interesting that, again, the 2nd of February is getting brought up because many dates are going to, some dates, like if we look at the festival of Juno Sospita, or not Sospita, Juno Februa, Juno the Chaste, her festival was celebrated on the 13th and 14th of February, and the link being that it was celebrating like her chasteness. And eventually when the Catholic Church comes in and kind of co-ops or takes over, the different celebrations and whatnot, they celebrate the Feast of the Purification of the Virgin. And, it has its connections with chaste Juno, but we're also going to find that when Christianity comes to Sweden, they're also going to change when this thing would normally be, and they're going to substitute it for Candlemas. And it's kind of a similar thing here, the 2nd of February. We celebrate, as a secular observance, Groundhog's Day. But anyway, just a lot of patterns showing up. So the autumn Dieselblot is described as specifically Icelandic and Norwegian. Okay, so it was really only observed in Iceland and Norway during pagan times. However, it's worth noting that the heathen organization of the community of Formsted, Sweden, formerly the Swedish Asatro community, they celebrate their Dieselblot in February. So again, the names are going to be used interchangeably. But technically, a Dieselblot can be celebrated at any time of the year. So the way that I've kind of looked at it is that Diesting is kind of like a big Dieselblot for a lot of people. It's more of a gathering. It's an assembly. There's still going to be a sacrifice, but it's bigger than a Dieselblot. And we'll also find the Dieselblot tends to be much more private too. So during the Old Norse period, like the 8th through 14th centuries Common Era, specific sacrifices were made at the beginning of winter during the more privately observed Alfablot and Dieselblot. So Alfablot was a sacrificial observance for the local land spirits. The celebration of Dieselblot in connection to the winter nights was generally celebrated within the home. And Dieselblot was a very private affair and often only involved immediate members of the household or homestead. As some historical texts attest, Dieselblot was so sacred that it was perhaps one of the only times that rites of hospitality could be ignored. It wasn't great to flout the social standards of hospitality, but it's rather significant that Dieselblot could be afforded this semi-exemption to the hospitality rule. And hospitality was a big deal in ancient cultures because they didn't have hotels or even inns or taverns to stop at for long periods of travel. They weren't always going to be guaranteed like a hot meal or a warm place. So if one had to, go on a journey or take a trip or travel anywhere, you were very beholden to the hospitality of people that you would come across. And, heaven forbid, if something were to befall you and you found yourself having to go out and, make any sort of excursion, you would want the same hospitality extended to you. So the fact that in some of these sagas, when travelers come across a household that is just completely boarded up and they're not being, at least greeted and then given something to drink or eat, it's a big deal. And so it's pretty significant if hospitality could be kind of ignored. So, modern Norse heathen pagan practices or practitioners often use Dieselblot interchangeably with Diesting. However, the Dieselblot observance is generally specific to the Icelandic and Norwegian Norse, and it occurred, of course, in around the time of the autumnal equinox. Diesting, on the other hand, as we now know, is more associated with Norse pagan practices of Uppland, Sweden, and it occurred in late winter, early spring. Further confusion has arisen, just to make it more confusing for you guys. Further confusion has arisen regarding the traditions surrounding Dieselblot versus the Alfablot. So, the Alfablot was an ancient Norse pagan ritual typically observed during the autumnal equinox, like Dieselblot. It was dedicated to the god Odin and other Norse deities, but Alfablot itself means sacrifice to the elves. So both Dieselblot and Alfablot reflected Norse pagan beliefs about the interconnectedness of humans, nature, and the supernatural world. The aim was to honor important spirits to maintain that balance, whether private or public. These rituals serve to foster reverence strengthen social bonds, and reaffirm cultural identity. And so as the Disir were guardian spirits to the family, the Alfar, that's just plural, Alf is the singular, but the Alfar were similar to the land. So they were the guardian spirits of the land and the natural environment. And as the Disir influenced familial fate, the Alfar affected the fertility of the land and agricultural success. So I just wanted to do a quick comparison here. So the Disaplot is, of course, the sacrifice to the Dis, who are the ancestral female spirits. And then the Alphablot is sacrifice to the Alfar, the ancestral-ish nature spirits. So both observances included offerings that could be burnt, that were included, and they would include specially made food, drink, or other items deemed valuable or symbolic. And it usually involved a ceremony, a libation, prayer, or chant. And a libation is just the pouring out of some liquid. Whether that's mead or blood, it is the pouring out. So Disablot would take place around the autumnal equinox, same with Alphabot, and they usually coincided with the seasonal changes. And if we look at the time around the autumnal equinox, this would have been usually a time of Thanksgiving, because the crops would have been harvested and processed. And so, especially if there was a surplus, people would have, celebrated that and had a little feast. So, Disablot generally occurred indoors on the homestead, but the Alphablot had to be outside. So, whether groves or natural springs, any place that it was believed that the elves or the elves inhabited, or where there was a connection to the spirit world, would have been a place where many offerings would be made. So residents of the homestead, familial, clan, or more localized group of people generally would get together to celebrate the Disablot in private, whereas the Alphablot, it was a more localized gathering of the community, and it would have been dependent on access to special natural sites, and it generally would have been more public than private, and more communal, including various members of the community, like the priests and chieftains and townsfolk, and specialists like the blacksmiths, or tanners, or whatever, distillers. All of these people would have been pretty vital to coming out and showing up kind of for their community. So the Disablot would honor and appease the spirits and seek favor, blessings, protection, especially for the family or clan. And the Alphablot was similar. It was basically just the same thing, but it was seeking the favor and blessings and protection for the community. So finally, we get to sacrifice. So human sacrifice has been practiced throughout the ages by many cultures worldwide. Some examples include, the Aztecs in Mesoamerica, the Scythians in Central Asia, the Phoenicians of the Levant, the Celts in Europe, and the Nordic peoples of Scandinavia, among others. So human sacrifice was often conducted to gain the favor of and or appease the gods in order to maintain cosmic balance. Contrary to popular belief, instead of the youthful virgin maiden, the vast majority of sacrificial victims were male prisoners of war. Males then, as now, were considered to be bigger, stronger, faster, and hence served as a more pleasing offering. when females were sacrificed, they were often killed as mistresses, servants, or slaves in order to accompany their masters into the afterlife. However, like the Phoenician Carthaginians only ever sacrificed children, infants. But the majority of sacrifices were meant to serve a religious, ceremonial, and or ritualistic burial purpose. So, just for reference, this is a map of Sweden, and then this is the county of Uppsala, and this is it just, expanded, made bigger, and then this is an aerial view of Gamla Uppsala, and this was a drawing done by Truls Arvidsson around 1709. And it's believed that these royal mounds can probably be dated back to 600 CE. It's probably even further back, but there was a medieval church somewhere built in here too, that dates from around the 12th century CE. So Gamla Uppsala was considered one of the oldest and most important Norse pagan sites. And the Danish Christian chronicler Saxo Grammaticus, circa 1150 to 1220 CE, claimed that Odin continually sojourned with somewhat especial constancy at Gamla Uppsala. And Saxo adds that the chief deity of the Vanir, Freyr, began the human sacrifices at Gamla Uppsala. Oh, jeez. That's crazy. Sorry, guys. Wow. So, this is a quote from Saxo. Quote, "Also Frey, the region of the gods, took up his abode not far from Uppsala, where he exchanged for a ghastly and infamous sin offering the old custom of prayer by sacrifice, which had been used by so many ages and generations. For he paid to the gods abominable offerings by beginning to slaughter human victims." So here now is another attestation, and they are described by Adam von Bremen, who was circa 1050 to 1080 CE. So, quote, "At this point, I shall say a few words about the religious beliefs of the Swedes. That nation has a magnificent temple, which is called Uppsala, located not far from the city of Sigtuna. In this temple, built entirely of gold, the people worship the statues of three gods, Odin, Freyr, and Thor. A general festival for all the provinces of Sweden is customarily held at Uppsala every 9 years. Participation in this festival is required of everyone. Kings and their subjects collectively and individually send their gifts to Uppsala. The sacrifice is as follows. Of every kind of male creature, 9 victims are offered. By the blood of these creatures, it is the custom to appease the gods. Their bodies, moreover, are hanged in a grove, which is adjacent to the temple. This grove is so sacred to the people that the separate trees in it are believed to be holy because of the death or putrefaction of the sacrificial victims. There, even dogs and horses hang beside human beings. A certain Christian told me that he had seen 72 of their bodies hanging up together. The incantations, however, which are usually sung in the performance of a libation, again, a libation is a pouring out of a substance, a liquid substance, sung in the performance of a libation of this kind are numerous and disgraceful, and it is better not to speak of them. Of course, Adam von Bremen is Christian, okay? So he's going to be biased. And of course, I mean, it's not good to do human sacrifice. So there is an additional description by Bremen. So, quote, Oh my gosh, sorry. Why is this happening? Okay. Sorry, guys. This additional quote. Near that temple is a very large tree with widespread branches, which are always green both in winter and summer. What kind of tree it is, nobody knows. There is also a spring there where the pagans are accustomed to perform sacrifices and to immerse a human being alive. As long as his body is not found, the request of the people will be fulfilled. A golden chain encircles that temple and hangs over the gables of the building. Those who approach see its gleam from afar off. Because the shrine, which is located on a plain, is encircled by mountains so situated as to give the effect of a theater. For 9 days, feasts and sacrifices of this kind are celebrated. Every day they sacrifice one human being in addition to other animals, so that in 9 days there are 72 victims which are sacrificed. The sacrifice takes place about the time of the vernal equinox. So, now in spring, this custom is happening in spring. And interestingly, there is not archaeological evidence to show that, 72 victims every 9 years were sacrificed. I think there is archaeological evidence to show that, yes, they have found human remains, but it is not nearly what Adam von Bremen is attesting to. And of course, that their temple is built entirely of gold. Yeah, built entirely of gold. No, I don't think so. So, Gamla Uppsala was the last stronghold of pre-Christian Norse-Germanic kingship. Around 1070 through 1080, a renaissance of Norse religion ensued with the contested eyewitness account of Adam von Bremen, describing the magnificent temple at Uppsala containing wooden statues of Odin, Thor, and Freyr, with the surrounding area as a pagan cult center. Its importance in Swedish culture led it to being commandeered as Sweden's first archbishopric in 1164 CE. Practically by then, the location lost its strategic importance when the waterway became less accessible or navigable, owing to constant post-glacial rebound. And this is interesting because the site was accessible through a waterway. And that's another parallel, So, now to quickly address some very recent, modern celebration, at least celebrated by some Asatru, called Valisblot, or the Feast of Vali. So this feast originally celebrated the death of Hothar at the hands of Vali. This late winter festival relates to the triumphant return of the light of the sun over the dark days of winter. Today it is traditional celebration of the family, a time for customary exchange of cards and gifts with loved ones. It is also a time for the renewal of marriage vows and an occasion for marriages. And this I got from this alsotrue.org/holidays, and this was the only site that I could find. I mean, I didn't look super hard, but I looked, good solid half hour, and this was the only site that I could find that talked about Valisblot, when it was, and what was done around it. And this is me adding this integrating commercial Valentine's Day. Like, it basically just seems like it's a ripoff of Valentine's Day, probably because Vali sounds like the first part of Valentine. But anyway, I thought to include it. Here is a depiction of Vali, and of course I could not find the illustrator. It was probably done, a while ago. So, if you'd like to watch the single most comprehensive video on how white supremacy movements co-opted pagan traditions, specifically the Norse and Germanic paganism, I highly recommend the channel All Eyes on Delphi, The Delphi Murders, Odinism. Okay? It's a very comprehensive documentary. It's a 2-hour-long documentary. For those limited on time, I recommend her other videos. One is called A Brief History of the Vinlanders Social Club, and another video that is called Votan's Folk, Gallows Tree, and the VSC. And the reason that I bring this up is because Asatru, at least in the United States, tends to have more folkish associations, meaning they tend to value more highly blood purity or what one's ancestry is, okay? And of course, we know from following this case that there is a connection to white supremacy, at least infiltrating, or to use a lot of people's words, the hijacking of Norse paganism. So, what I could find on what Vali's bloat should be is this term horning. Okay? So, in the context of Asatru, the horning can refer to a ritual or ceremony involving, a cat, involving the drinking of meat or ale from a ceremonial horn. And this practice is part of Asatru and Norse pagan traditions, where mead or another beverage is passed around and shared among participants as a communal act of celebration or honoring of the gods and spirits. The horn itself holds symbolic significance, representing hospitality, kinship, and connection to the divine. Drinking from the horn is seen as a way to establish bonds of friendship, unity, and respect within the community. So, the term horning can also refer more broadly to the act of making offerings or libations, and a libation, to the gods and spirits, often accompanied by spoken prayers or invocations. So, given that I couldn't find much on Vali's bloat, I decided to tell a story about Vali, or the story, I guess, because there's not much on Vali either. But, so, while the celebration of Vali's bloat is a very recent invention and appears only to be observed by a very niche set of practitioners within the subset of the practitioners of Asatru, or the Astruar, or whatever you call them, we will examine its mythological associations, as not much else exists on its origins. So, in Norse mythology, Vali was the son of Odin and the Jotun, or the giantess, Rinda. He was born for the sole purpose of avenging the death of his half-brother Balder, over here. Again, another very old, probably print of an old drawing that I could not find. Who did this? Avenging the death. He was born for the sole purpose of avenging the death of his half-brother Balder, who was killed by Loki's trickery. And there's Loki, done by a modern artist, not going to say that name correctly, from 2014, but I really loved this rendition. So, Balder was the beloved son of Odin and Frigg, and was known for his beauty and goodness. He was also considered invulnerable, as his mother Frigg devoted great efforts to secure oaths from all things not to harm him. However, the cunning Loki found a single weakness, learning that Frigg had overlooked the mistletoe because it seemed harmless and insignificant. Loki then devised a deceitful plan to kill Balder and divert culpability by exploiting the blindness of another of Odin's sons, Hother. So, crafting a sharp projectile, an arrow or spear, out of mistletoe Loki discreetly approached the blind Hother. Here you can see him creepy and approaching this guy that has his eyes closed. Loki discreetly approached the blind Hother and offered to guide him in a game where the gods would throw objects at Balder for fun, knowing that nothing could hurt him. And this image also shows like all the different items that are just cast and strewn about him, because he's impervious to being struck by anything that could harm him. So, handing Hother the mistletoe, Loki directed his aim toward Balder. Hother hurled the mistletoe missile and tragically struck Balder, killing him instantly. So Balder's death then brought immense grief and mourning to the Aesir. And Loki's deception of Hother and murderous aims highlights his cunning, malicious nature. Many of the Norse myths portray Loki as harboring resentment and jealousy toward the other gods, particularly those who were celebrated like Balder, but also Odin, Thor, Tyr, Freyr, Freya, and Heimdall. Balder's popularity and invulnerability was the likely source of Loki's envy. Also, the fact that Loki was a Jotun, like through and through, both parents were, despite his close association with the Aesir, cast him as more of an outsider. Although his disruptive behavior and devious plots probably didn't help his cause to fit in, most difficult people act out from lack. So Loki's actions were likely a means of asserting himself to challenge the gods he felt rejected him. Generally, Loki's character is known for sowing chaos and discord. His actions against Balder reflect a broader pattern of antagonism, driven by a desire to disrupt the established order and challenge the conventions of the divine realm. So killing the beloved Balder created anguish and chaos. Manipulating the situation to both vilify Hother and eliminate Balder sets off a chain of tragic consequences, becoming the precursor of the coming of Ragnarok, which is the apocalypse, the end of the world, and the time of the gods. So, Balder's death afflicted his mother with an inconsolable sorrow. In her state of anguish, Frigg sought to resurrect her son. Traveling to the realm of the dead, Helheim, Frigg attempted to negotiate Balder's release and his return to the land of the living. Hel agreed to release Balder on the condition that all beings, living and dead, wept for him as a sign of their mourning. So if Balder was shown to be properly mourned by all beings, he would be deemed worthy and justified in his return to the realms of the living. So with this, messages were sent throughout the 9 worlds to plead for Balder's return. All beings wept for Balder, except for one giantess named Thok, Loki in disguise, who refused to mourn his death. As a result, Hel refused his release, and Balder was bound to his abode in the realm of the dead. So, in another version of the story, or as an amendment to this story, Balder's father, Odin, unable to return his son to life, seeks other means to right the wrong. Odin may have loved his deceased son, but he had foreseen prophetic visions of Balder's death as being the catalyst for bringing about Ragnarok and the end of the world. Odin believed by avenging his son's death, he may be able to avert the prophecy. So, in his quest to save the world, Odin then attempts to seduce a Jotun princess, Rinda, and approaching her in disguise, Odin uses all forms of enchantment to try and woo the princess, but she wants nothing to do with him. So eventually Odin resorts to a coercive form of magic, basically stripping Rinda of her free will and impregnating her with a child. And this child was Vali. and he would grow to full maturity in the span of one day. So, on reaching adulthood, Vali immediately set to the task of avenging his brother Balder. Vali then ruthlessly, efficiently pursued and killed his half-brother Hother. So like many of the Norse myths, the story lacks a happy ending. Retribution was fulfilled, but problematically so. Consider that a brother is accidentally killed by another brother. Then consider that behind that accident was malicious intent by an outside actor. Had Frigg or Odin properly examined the situation or sought out the truth of the matter, they might have discovered that the real culprit was Loki. Instead, efforts made by the mother to bring back her son are again thwarted by the exact same instigator, Loki. And far worse, the father uses dishonorable means on an unsuspecting woman who will neither be his wife nor enjoy motherhood to beget a son who will have no childhood and will exist for the sole purpose of murdering a half-brother he's never met and to avenge another half-brother he'll never meet. So the idea of retribution in the story seems incongruous and disproportional. Paradoxically, more crimes have been committed in the attempt to right a wrong than in the commission of the initial crime. Vali's role in the Norse myths highlights themes of vengeance, fate, and the cyclical nature of actions, where one act of violence sets off an unending chain reaction. So, apart from the story, Vali only appears in vague references regarding the defense of Asgard during Ragnarok. And he will be one of the only surviving deities to see the creation of the New World. Although I do think that Balder then eventually returns after the world ends, and I think Vali then probably gets to meet him. So, in comparison to many other Norse deities, it is bizarre that such a minor character would be given his own feast day, other than, in my opinion, this is strictly my opinion, other than its name sounding similar to Valentine, or at least the first half, the Val part. So if Vali were to be properly celebrated, it seems that an act of revenge would be necessary if you really wanted to celebrate him on the 14th. So, and then this is a depiction of Hother by this artist that I could not access the name to, but this is where I got it from. So, this is where I leave you to consider the information provided in these 3 presentations. If anybody gets through all 3 of them, it'll be a miracle, but, good on you. It's just, thank you. But, just to kind of recap, briefly the dates of occurrence of the presumed kidnapping and murders of Abby Williams and Libby German are believed to be the 13th and 14th of February. Despite being sunny and relatively warm for mid-February, Monday the 13th was a day off school. It was a snow day. I felt and still feel the timeline or timelines to be unreliable, and I use the example of the death certificates to demonstrate that concern without diverging into other aspects of the case, which would be off topic for the overall subject matter of these presentations. But, their recently released new defense Frank's filings are showing now that Libby's phone was pinging around 2 or 3, I think 2:30 a.m. on the 14th. Which is interesting. So, Instead of a timeline, I decided to strictly look into any special connections to the dates of occurrence. I began by reviewing some of the clues submitted within the original Franks memorandum filed by the defense team of Richard Allen. Since many of those clues, I called them the 4 leads, pointed to the crime having an over amount of non-secular symbolism, I knew that I'd have to consider observances that were either religious or spiritual in nature. I also had to consider the demographics of the area, which was overwhelmingly white with European ancestry. I found stats showing that of the 38 to 39% of Carroll County that I identified as religious, nearly all of them were some denomination of Christian. Naturally, I started by looking into Christian observances that fell on the 13th and 14th of February. And Valentine's Day is commercially celebrated in the US on the 14th. Working my way back in time, I found that Christianity was heavily influenced by paganism, especially the paganism of ancient Rome. Several observances and festivities corresponded with the 13th and 14th of February, including the Ides, the full moon, and the celebration of Faunus, a fertility horned god, a horned fertility god, better way to say it. The 9-day festival of Parentalia, which is an ancestral celebration, and then even a festival honoring the chaste Juno, which then, possibly shows up in Candlemas with the purification of the Virgin. So, this final presentation has expanded geographically in scope to look at Northern European and Scandinavian pagan customs. Like ancient Rome, the Norse and Germanic pagans revered their ancestors and devoted special occasions and gatherings to honor them. As Christianity began to infiltrate deeper into the continent, it began adopting many of the beliefs and practices of pagan cultures to make the conversion process less painful. Kingdom-wide celebrations like Disting in Sweden got moved to a fixed date in early February, overlapping with Candlemas and the purification of the Virgin. However, amid all the overlap and integration and even outright modern fabrication like Fally's bloat, one thing is abundantly clear. The only well-documented observance known to have included ritual human sacrifice occurred in pagan Sweden during Disting. As we've gone over, Disting, if being practiced today, would have fallen around the dates Abby and Libby were murdered. So, I cannot definitively prove this is why the girls were killed. But I can ask questions like, what are the chances that runic symbols found at a double homicide crime scene, as well as the date of those homicides occurring on or around one of the only very well-attested Norse pagan observances, which included ritual human sacrifice, what are the chances that just those 2 factors are unrelated? Is it possible that these 2 kids were killed with a ritual in mind? Was this an intentional ritual? Was this meant to replicate a ritual or appear as a ritual? I think these questions should be asked. They are worth asking. Again, without apprehending the proper perpetrator or perpetrators and then extracting information from them, we can never definitively prove anything. But as a thinking person, what am I supposed to do with this information besides share it and ask for other opinions? And again, thank you for your time. Thank you so much. Let's see what else we have here. Oh, this is the famous runic poem. This is supposed to be from Odin's point of view when he sacrifices himself for the runes. So, I ween that I hung on the windy tree, hung there for nights full 9. With the spear I was wounded, and offered I was to Odin, myself to myself, on the tree, that none may ever know what root beneath it runs. None may be happy with loaf or horn, and there below I looked. I took up the runes, shrieking I took them, and forthwith back I fell. 9 mighty songs I got from the son of Bothorn, Besla's father, and a drink I got of the goodly mead poured out from Otharir. Then began I to thrive, and wisdom to get, and grew, and well I was. Each word led me on to another word, each deed to another deed. Runes shalt thou find, and faithful signs that the kings of singers colored, and the mighty gods have made. Full strong the signs, full mighty the signs, that the ruler of gods doth write. So here is a list of my sources. This presentation was a little rushed. I'm not gonna lie. I would have preferred to have put in each and every citation, but here we are. I noticed I had quite a few spelling and grammatical mistakes, so I apologize. The numbering is off, but I wanted to get this out because the trial is coming up, and it may not even be usable, anything that relates to Odinism. God. But, I still wanted to do it because I wanted to do it. I wanted to be able to sleep, I wanted to feel like I tried. Because I feel like just from my own opinion, actually, I feel like there's so much that is outside of my control, and I really, really want this man, who I truly believe is innocent, to get his life back. Because there's just something about him and his family that's like, that could have been my family. That could have been my dad, or my brother, or my husband. He's like somebody that we all know, I want it to be resolved, but I want it all. I want him to be exonerated. I want the right people to be caught. And then I want a trial that we can watch. And I want everything to come out. And I don't think we're ever going to know why. Which is, I don't know if I need to know why. But I certainly don't want to be taunted. I don't want to have it rubbed in my face, like I feel like even the investigators are doing, of, no, that's just your perception, you're just perceiving it wrong, you're hallucinating. And I don't think I am. I feel like I'm being gaslit. And, it's my own bias, it's my own emotion coming into this case, but I see how hard real people are working, the people that can do something, the lawyers on this case, and they're real heroes. Those should be our heroes. People who fight so that a man can have his life back. And you know, I know nothing about law, but this was something I could do. No matter how big or small, this was something that I could do. So I wanted to get out other presentations before this trial. I don't know if that's going to happen. But I wanted to talk about the tree and the blood on the tree. And I wanted to talk about the location with running water in kind of an alcove or like a grove of trees with a bridge, you know, and kind of the background there, a looming bridge, and the symbolism connected with that. And I wanted to describe more in depth how paganism is very personalized, and, you know, briefly kind of go over the history of it, you know, how it stems from a bunch of different traditions and philosophies and religions and whatnot. But I'm still happy that I got as far as I did, and I couldn't have gotten there without people watching. And for that, oh, for that I'm very grateful. Yeah. I think there are a bunch of heroes out there. We do what we can, but I'm proud to be a part of it. And I'm very appreciative of people who have, you know, supported me along the way. And that's you guys. So, thank you so much. I don't know if I'll have like anything long format, comprehensive to put out before the trial. You know, I might even break up some of these presentations into smaller little blurbs or something. I would love to hear recommendations on that too, if there's certain parts that seem more relevant or interesting. Also, I apologize for my cat. I don't know why it's like the second I need to do something important, he's right there. But he's a good guy. He's just a cat. But yeah, basically, you know, I love all you guys. And thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So, have a good night, and I hope to talk to you soon.